If you want to balance your training schedule in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu versus your other commitments, whether that's work, personal, school, I want you to avoid making these common mistakes. The first mistake is overcommitting to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This may sound a little bit weird, but I've seen it a lot. You know what they say, the brightest star burns out the fastest. And while technically, in theory, if you train 5 or 6 times per week, you'll get better faster than someone who's training less. It's unsustainable over a few years, right? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ideally is going to be a lifelong, maybe not lifelong, at least few years long commitment. If you're going to get the most out of it, I'd recommend committing to purple belt, but it's going to be different for everybody. I wouldn't recommend showing up to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a month and a half and quitting. You won't get the most benefit out of it. Ideally, show up until you get a submission, then you recognize whether or not it's for you. More ideally, you show up until you get your blue belt, and then perfectly you show up until you get purple belt, because then you're like really pretty good. And at that point, you've seen what there is to get out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But if you show up 5 times a week, you're probably not going to be able to stick with it for a few years, which is where you're going to get the most benefit. Really, you want to achieve a blue belt level of skill so you can handle yourself against most people who have never trained before that are about your equivalent size. It'll give you more confidence when you're out walking. It'll give you a better idea of where you stand. If you make it to purple belt, that's ideal, but regardless, you need at least a few years to get the most out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And it's hard to stay on that 5 or 6 days per week commitment. And what'll end up happening is you'll be doing it, you'll be getting better faster, you'll be making lots of progress, progressing, getting stripes on that white belt, maybe even waiting to blue, it's coming up, it's coming up, it's coming up. But then something happens in life and you just fall off completely because you got to completely shift priorities, and then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu becomes this thing that you used to do and you burn out. So what I'd recommend doing is starting off with a minimum number of days per week that you're absolutely 100% guaranteed to go. For most people, I would recommend 3 days per week, but if you can get 2 solid days per week where you know you're always going to Tuesdays and Thursdays, and maybe you do 1 weekend class if you're available. And if you're solid about those 2, meaning you're going every single week, no matter what, if you can help it, and if you miss one, you make it up the next day. But every single week, those 2 consistent days, you'll do a lot better than someone who shows up, goes really, really hard, and then peters out. And goes really, really hard for a few weeks, and then gets an injury and doesn't come back for a little while. And it's been a few years, and they're on again, off again. Keep that consistency, because then it's going to start to build upon itself, and you're never going to have to relearn. One of the most tragic things in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is that the skill kind of depreciates if you stop training. So obviously you can get to a point where you've got a base of skill you're never going to lose, but that takes a while. When you're a white belt too, it's even harder. So if you keep that consistency, you're going to be always just adding on 1 or 2% versus the guy who shows up really, really hard and goes super, super fast and all these classes 5, 6 days a week and then stops and then goes back and then builds up and then stops and then goes back a little bit and then stops versus the guy who's slowly chugging away. Eventually, the consistent person will overtake the inconsistent but really intense person. So don't go too much and burn out, but also don't go too little and forget about it. 1 day per week is kind of not enough to progress. It's enough to keep you in the game, to keep your skills kind of where they're at, but you're really not going to be making consistent progress. I'd say 2 bare minimum per week. If you can do 2 bare minimum per week where you're consistent, you'll slowly start to see incremental progress. Now, if you can do 3 on average with a bonus 4th day, then you're going to be progressing really, really fast. And priorities are going to change over time. You might have a job that gives you a lot of free time in the mornings or in the afternoon so you can make a certain section of classes. But over the years, as you go through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, check out my videos on the great filters, priorities can change, and after that, unfortunately, you might find yourself not able to go to Jiu-Jitsu because you have to take on this other commitment. And if you're able to keep a consistent 2 days per week, even on priority changing, you're going to get a lot of benefit out of it. So balance it the best you can, but definitely try not to burn out.